your investment in your tech stack, it's not going to fix a broken process. All it's going to do is make it worse if you don't have a good process. You can't just stack a bunch of like shiny tools on top of a process that doesn't work. All it's going to do is it's going to blow up in your face once you start getting out of 5 hires into 50 hires into 500 hires.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you with us today. We're going to talk about some psychiatric healthcare recruiting, which sits right at the intersection of several really difficult pressures. We have rising demand for behavioral health services across the country, very constrained clinical labor supply, complex operating environments, and increasing expectations around speed, quality, and candidate experience. This is a segment of healthcare where recruiting can't be just treated as a standalone function. The ability to attract and hire talent directly tied to care access, staffing models, operational discipline, and the credibility of the employment experience. I'll introduce you to someone who's worked across several different healthcare recruiting environments, including HCA Healthcare, Acadia, and now NPH. That gives you a really unique perspective on recruiting at an enterprise scale, recruiting inside of psychiatric healthcare specifically, and then building scalable recruiting inside of a growing organization. So first, I'd just like to say, can you give us a quick version of your background, Justin, and how these different environments have shaped you, and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, thanks for having me. So my name is Justin McComber. I have been with NeuroPsychiatric Hospitals now for a couple of years, and my journey here is just like every other recruiter's, right? I went to school, I got the degree in recruiting. No, I'm just kidding. Like, of course, I got into recruiting through the HR, kind of the HR side of things. I came out of school, I, got a couple of jobs as a generalist coordinator, ultimately ended up at HCA working for you, and kind of got into the high volume clinical recruiting, which really was kind of my calling and kind of sung to me. So was able to do that for about a year, and then took the big challenge of going over to Acadia Healthcare and kind of taking a lot of my knowledge from HCA at large publicly traded, super scaled, massive company, and went over to Acadia Healthcare, which specializes in standalone acute psychiatric care. So I did that for 5 years, and then ultimately ended up here at NeuroPsychiatric, and we do psychiatric healthcare as well. We have 8 hospitals, roughly 1,000 employees. It's a smaller, right, private equity backed firm rather than kind of the big publicly traded companies like HCA and Acadia, but still working in that standalone acute psychiatric space. With a twist, though, because our hospital company here also takes medically complex patients. So there's a little bit of a nuance there that I'm sure we'll get into. But, my journey has primarily been in healthcare. I'm a healthcare staffing lifer, so to speak, and been able to work at, the largest of large, the mothership of HCA, and then also, kind of coming down back to NPH where, we're still growing and we're still kind of building out. And it's been a super cool experience to kind of see both ends of those spectrums, from, kind of being a badge swipe and a number to, I report directly to the CEO now, and kind of the differences between those environments, but also the value of learning and being able to kind of, operate and be successful in both environments.
Yeah, that's a mix that really gives you a very unique and very valuable perspective, because you have seen that kind of mature scale, in an organization like HCA where, operational discipline is ingrained in so much of what they do. And HCA, which is building in psychiatric because they see that need as well, but clearly not, the same kind of scale and penetration of psychiatric that you guys had there. And now you're building that scalable recruiting infrastructure, earlier in the company's growth curve, which is a whole different kind of challenge. And an interesting point, Justin did move from HCA to Acadia, but that literally meant moving how many floors in the same building, Justin? We still used to run into each other in the elevator for quite some time after that. So it was a company move, but physically stayed right next to his pre-existing team, so we could stay close. How would you describe the current state of psychiatric healthcare in the U.S. now?
Yeah, challenging. I mean, I think anyone who's in healthcare staffing is going to say the word challenging. But psych specifically is it's under a lot of stress. The pandemic really kind of exacerbated the mental health and behavioral health needs in the country. And the workforce obviously was kind of pulled in multiple directions, right, with kind of pandemic response and kind of that model. And then what kind of happened after, you saw massive burnout, you saw people retiring, you saw people changing, careers altogether. But one of the lingering effects is kind of a growth in demand for, mental and behavioral health care, specifically in the acute psychiatric space. So, we were experiencing that in real time, just like, the emergency departments and ICUs, because there was so much strain put on the system altogether, right? So the demand was sky high, but the, supply of labor was exceedingly low. And, people were leaving and getting pulled away to go and work, in these hospitals that were treating COVID and, getting these massive, incentives, but they were also getting burned out and they were, under that constant stress. And so a lot of people kind of left the market, or kind of, maybe I'll go work outpatient, maybe I'll go work in doctor's office, of course, telehealth, right? So we're seeing kind of a unique pressure because of just the tremendous exponential growth in demand, of the treatment model. So, I think there's some positive in that. Like I think the stigma of seeking treatment is starting to kind of whittle away. And that's an important thing, right? You need to seek treatment if you're having mental and behavioral health, issues, diagnoses, and making sure that you're seeking that treatment just like you would any other healthcare, diagnoses. But with that, obviously you're seeing it present, pretty large, across the country. You're probably seeing more people coming into the emergency departments. You're seeing more referrals. You're also seeing, like I said, more telehealth and more psychiatrists and providers going into that space to kind of do those virtual care structures. So it's as high as ever, and the demand is higher than ever. But the acuity, the staffing, the availability of beds. I mean, a lot of communities are still very underbedded, right? For kind of standalone psych. And so these patients, they just flow into emergency rooms, and those take up beds for, other folks who need those, because those rooms are not necessarily, set up for our population. So they have to go somewhere, and those are going to take up beds. And there's, that whole pattern, and then you get into the economics of it. There's parity issues with payers. We don't get paid necessarily the same that, medical hospitals get paid, and the reimbursements are different. The denials are higher. The, pre-authorizations can be kind of a pain. So there's some administrative burden as well that, I know exists across the spectrum, but in psych, it's specifically, it's uniquely high, I would say, uniquely high. Lots of red tape and lots of, admin that goes into that.
Well, yeah, I know the number they used to throw out at HCA, I believe, was 40% of people coming into the emergency room are exhibiting some sort of behavioral health need. That might not even be the reason they came into the emergency room. Of course, some do come in because of behavioral health issue only, but the behavioral health as a part of a total care plan for people is huge. When you think about people who maybe have lost a limb in an accident, they're dealing with cancer, all these different things that people, when they come into the hospital, it's usually not a good thing. It's a bad thing and stressful time in their lives, and they're very vulnerable. And so that behavioral health need becomes, really, really critical to really treating the entire patient. So a lot of your patients then are, I know in some cases you are embedded in a hospital at like an Acadia, in places like that. But in yours, you're standalone. So a lot of yours are transfers then coming out of these acute care centers that don't have behavioral health services.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of our referrals come from emergency departments, or kind of local hospitals, we also take, long-term care memory unit patients, so they're coming from a third party and basically coming to us for stabilization. So, I do know there's kind of a growing segment within the industry of kind of like these, joint ventures where they're kind of built in together. They're like right across the street from the campus, but ours are truly standalone. So they're being transported in, typically from another facility, which also makes it, adds another layer of complexity, because then you're having to do a whole new admission and intake, and you're having to kind of do the actual physical transfer of someone
Sure.
who may be in a psychiatric, event at that moment. And that's a whole nother layer of complexity there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So before recruiting even enters the conversation, the operating environment they're dealing with has a huge amount of pressure. I mean, the high demand, the acuity, the access, it really all depends on whether you have the right people in the right place at the right time to be able to service those patients. So how do these psychiatric care realities translate into recruiting challenges?
Yeah, I think this is really the crux of the challenge, because the reason people get into the work is also the biggest kind of barrier to, long-term success in the role. So our patients are, the highest acuity level in psychiatric care. So when we're doing inpatient psychiatric care, we're talking about patients who typically present as psychotic. They have bipolar, they're schizophrenic, they could be self-harming or wanting to harm others. And our job is to literally stabilize them so that we can step them down and get them to the next care level, right? Imagine someone presenting at an emergency department for a heart attack. We're stabilizing the heart attack, and then we're sending them on to the cardiologist, right? That's kind of the goal. That's the idea. But those patients that come in, some of them may have not been to a medical facility in quite some time. Some of them have underlying health conditions that may be, undiagnosed, or may have gone a while without being treated. Some of them, most of our patients don't believe or think they should be there in the first place, which is also a challenge, right? Because not many patients who are having a heart attack are telling you, hey, I don't need to be here, I'm leaving, get the car. So I think that's a challenge in and of itself, is just understanding that when you are working with psychiatric patients, they're patients who are in significant need, and they need help in a lot of areas, right? But they're not always there to work with you. And it's your job to kind of use your clinical judgment, use your empathy, your discernment, all those different kind of soft skills to really help the patient along in their care journey. And that's different than, I'm taking a blood draw, I'm doing a cath, I'm doing EK, all the different kind of hard skills. It's much more soft skill oriented. So that's the first thing. The other thing is just the physical space of the hospital, right? So you're talking about patients who are, like I said, they're there for psychiatric evaluation. They've been transitioned to our hospital, so they're there to kind of stabilize. Well, when you're in an emergency department, and I have this happen all the time with ED nurses who want to work for us, and they'll be like, well, when I was at such and such emergency department, they called me the psych nurse because they would send all the holds to me and I did great with them. And that's wonderful. And we want those people, right? There's an interest there. There's a familiarity there. But we always ask the question, it's like, okay, but what happens when they're with you for an entire week? What happens when you have 14 of them? And what happens when they can get up and they can walk around, and you have to be the one to kind of watch them, be with them, treat them as they're kind of progressing through their treatment model, and they don't get sent to us after, 48 to 72 hours. That puts a whole different spin on it. So I think that those are kind of the two biggest pieces. There aren't a lot of nurses that come out of school. That's another challenge with psych. I think the most recent data is like 2% of graduating nurses that come out have true psych experience. They'll do a psych rotation, or they'll, as part of kind of their clinicals, but true like standalone acute psych is a totally different level of care than most kind of new grads are experiencing. And so most of the nurses that we get are outside of the industry, and they're they've exhibited some of those soft skills, or maybe they have, a passion for it and a heart for it, and they want to kind of come in and use their skills in that way. And we have to be kind of ready to upskill them and bring them up to speed. But most of the time, it's just people who are really passionate about it. Maybe people who have worked with, like I said, that population in a different environment. Maybe they've worked at a community health center, outpatient, kind of a different level of care. But there's always going to be that, there's always just going to be that kind of feeling out process once the candidate turns into an employee and comes onto the unit with us, because now we're talking about, like I said, patient acuity, and the amount of staffing levels are different than other hospitals. Most hospitals don't carry security like back in the day, right? They used to kind of call them orderlies. That's not a therapeutic setting for most patients to have, big security guards on the unit. So most of our employees are responsible for, de-escalation and making sure that the patients and the staff are safe. So there's a whole new element of that within the care model that you have to kind of get used to. And so really what it comes down to, Jason, is, why are you here? Do you love it? Is this a population that you truly love? And can you show up every day with patients that are truly in distress, right? And that are going through some of the worst times of their lives, and treat them like you would treat your family who's going through the same thing? That's what we always talk about here is, would I want my family member to be treated here? Because these are the most vulnerable, and they're in a very vulnerable time. And we have to be able to meet that. So, kind of to your point, like generic branding, not necessarily going to be something that we can pull on. Kind of going out and recruiting like an HCA or some of the other larger healthcare companies is not going to work for us, because we are recruiting against them, but it's a completely different type of care, and it's a completely different value proposition. The value proposition is, you want to help your community. You want to help the people that are in your community. The value prop is, I want to be a part of the solution to helping with the mental health crisis that's in this country.
Yeah, I think I told you the story when we were doing prep for this. I had a neighbor who was a career psych nurse, and she wasn't doing it anymore, and I asked her why, and she said, I just can't take a punch as well as I used to be able to when I was younger, and not that, nurses are getting beat up every day in your psych centers, but it happens, right? That you have outbursts from these people who have, mental challenges, and they have to deal with those real time. And that takes a different, kind of person, when you don't have that, again, that typical, I don't want to say inmate, but, institutional, kind of, environment that they used to have in the psychiatric hospitals years ago. And mostly, as these patients are voluntary. They can leave. And if you really want to care for the patient, part of it is you got to get them to stay there. And so if you make the environment too rigid, too threatening, of course, they're not going to stay there. Mostly people who are already in a unstable state. So that adds a whole different level to it. How much of the challenge is compensation versus perception of the work?
Comp is, if we're talking just base pay, not necessarily. I mean, we can be competitive-ish. It's never going to pay what some of like the bigger hospitals pay or some of the bigger specialties. I think total comp can be in there, just from a size standpoint, kind of what the bigger hospital systems can pay, like, with reimbursements and bonuses and shift differentials and, those type of things can kind of stack up. But ultimately, yeah, it's the perception of work, and getting nurses to believe that it's not a less than career path. It's not a place where you kind of, if you can't make it other places, you go. It's not necessarily kind of a JV position. I think that's much more of the challenge. And just the fact that, I still think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings of what it actually looks like. We'll get nurses or techs or whomever to come on site, and they'll be like, "Oh man, this is such a modern hospital. It's so nice. It's, and it's like, yeah, we're not, it's not, it's not like, Shutter Island or something like that. The modern complexes, the modern facilities are very nice. They're built to be, therapeutic. They're built to keep most importantly, they're built to keep the patient safe and the staff safe. So, there's a lot of infrastructure build out that goes into it. And, even little things like that of like, where am I going to work every day? Well, I go and see this big, huge, shiny, hospital up the road. That's my perception of what a hospital is. Well, this other hospital must be less than. I think that's more of the challenge. And then just, like your friend said, like, I can't take a punching. Well, yeah, the patient population is always going to be the biggest barrier is, do we want to work with the patient population? So comp comes into play. Of course, you need to be fairly compensated. I think we do a pretty good job at NPH of putting together competitive pay packages for our employees, given the environment. But, if you're coming to work at a psych hospital for the paycheck, it's probably going to be a hard no for you, because you're not going to last, because when that paycheck cashes and the next day you're still getting, you're still having to respond to patient issues or patient, behavior and things like that. Is it really going to keep you there? Is it really worth it? Most times it's probably not.
So what do your recruiters really need to understand before they can credibly recruit for this inpatient psychiatric care? And how do you actually put them through that understanding, immerse them into it?
Yeah. I think it's a lot of what we've kind of touched on. I mean, the clinical environment is really important. I think the flow of what the patient life cycle looks like from the time they're admitted to discharge is important, because you have to be able to speak the language of the nurses or the therapists. We see this the most in therapy, because we do have therapists on site with our hospital, with our patients. And the difference between that modality and maybe like an outpatient modality or like a virtual modality is completely different, right? The patients are not there for longer than a week. How do you make therapeutic connections in only a week, right? That's a whole different world for a lot of clinicians. How do you put a treatment plan together when you're on treatment team, or how do you put together, your notes from your time with the patient? How do you do groups? That's a whole different level. So you have to understand what the patient is actually doing on a day-to-day basis and how that's going to work in the milieu, how it's going to work from just a patient flow standpoint. Of course, like understanding the diagnoses, the patient population, so that you can accurately explain that. I think one of the things that we really have to harp on, and we did this at Acadia, we do it here. Realistic job preview it's not just a buzzword. Like, that is a must. If you do not give a realistic job preview to your candidates, you're setting yourself up for failure on both sides. And that's one of the worst things in the world for us, is for a clinician, a nurse, a caregiver to come in and opt out after the fact. We want them to opt out before, because once we put them on the floor with a patient, that's clinical, that's, therapy, that's clinical connection, that is clinical continuity that we have to create. So I think that part is really important. And then other things like, kind of the two sides of the same coin I talked about. One is the why. We try to get them to also have a why. Why do you want to work in behavioral health? Why are you here to help us staff up a hospital that is treating this particular diagnosis? I'm not a caregiver, right? I could never do what the nurses do, but I care about this population. I want to help. And so I help by doing this, right? That's what we're trying to find within our own recruiters. They have to have a why too, because recruiting in general can be a pretty frustrating gig, right? I always kind of equate it to like baseball, right? Where like you can fail a lot more than you succeed and be a pretty good recruiter. But you have to be able to go through that, and you have to be able to kind of deal with that. And if you're constantly losing candidates to hospital X or company Y, and you don't care about the patients and what you're doing, you're not gonna be able to stick around and do that meaningful work. And then the final thing I think is the other side of that coin is just making sure that they have an understanding of kind of the emotional support that's needed to work at a hospital, because you're going to see some pretty complex things in the hospital, but you're also going to see some pretty amazing things. You're going to see people get better, which is what we live for, right? We want to see patients from the time they are, admitted to the time they're discharged get better. And that's a wonderful thing. But there's also going to be some challenging things that you're going to see, and you have to be able to have the emotional support of that. So we have our recruiters also to make sure that they understand that piece of it so they can talk to the candidates about that.
Well, these are great examples of why recruiting can't be separated from operations. If the employment experience doesn't match the recruiting message, the story falls apart really quickly. But everybody wants better tools. Everybody wants more applicants, better advertising, now AI. But why is it operational discipline still the foundation of recruiting success? And tell me how you took what you learned at HCA and applied that as you move throughout your career.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And that was something like I think that I've been blessed with, to see the experience of like the pinnacle and kind of like the biggest scale possible. So I know what it can look like down the road. But the truth is like your investment in your tech stack, it's not going to fix a broken process. All it's going to do is make it worse if you don't have a good process. So, you can't just stack a bunch of like shiny tools on top of a process that doesn't work, whether it's your selection process, whether it's your submittal process, whether it's even just the way that, your candidate life cycle works. If you're just taking that and it's kind of all over the place, and there's no definition to it, all it's going to do is it's going to blow up in your face once you start getting out of 5 hires into 50 hires into 500 hires. So, things like how quickly you respond. Well, one of the biggest things that I learned, right, from HCA is the concept of the SLA, right? That service level agreement. It's the first thing that I did when we went to Acadia. It's the first thing I did here, because there has to be a mutual understanding in the business of how quickly we expect people to be put through the process. Just like in sales, like time kills deals, and in healthcare, most of our nurses are talking to at least 2, maybe 3 other employers when they're talking to us. Then you bring in AI on the candidate side, which allows them to, apply at scale with very little kind of thought behind it. And that speed to hire is so important. Well, if you're not set up for that on the front end, good luck trying to put it in later on. So, if your funnel is broken, if it's leaky, it doesn't matter how great your AI tool is, your chatbot is, how good your programmatic is. If you go to put in the funnel and they all leave, right? Or they're slowly progressing through, or there's not a clear understanding of what each function in that funnel should look like. And that's why like setting up those workflows ahead of time and giving very clear, concise, not just expo timelines. I think timelines are so big, and understanding what each piece of the funnel looks like, and more so what to look for when it's not working. That is something that I think is a really big point of emphasis when you're building out a process. Is you are, especially if you're at a smaller company, or you're growing a new team, or maybe you're just in hyperscale mode, right? You cannot always find every single thing every single day. You've got to be able to build into your process red flags and things that are going to come up when things don't work before you see the end result, before that manager's on the phone being, "Hey, Justin, where the hell were my nurses?" Mm-hmm. You have to be able to identify that 3 steps up, right? So that takes a lot of kind of, I would say intentionality is the word that I would use, intentionality in setting it up, to make sure that your recruiters know their workflows. And more so, that's important because they need to know when that workflow is kind of broken or something's off, right? And you don't know that unless you set that up ahead of time. And we do that with the SLAs. The timing mechanism is so important because I can look and see in a healthy environment, here's how long this should take based on our SLA. Well, now we're lagging, or now we're way ahead. Being way ahead isn't always the greatest thing either, because then you're like, okay, what are we skipping? Are we cutting corners? Are we skipping a crucial step, especially in the selection process, in the interview process, whatever the case may be. So having that up front, it's hard to put in later. So having that up front is important. The other part of it too, and I think this is why I always laugh about like AI is going to take over the recruiters. Well, until the robots can talk to hiring managers and talk them out of things, or get them to respond to an email, or get them to actually hold to a deadline, I'm not super concerned, because the robots will just tell the hiring managers what they want to hear. That's such a pivotal part, right? Is hiring managers and having the visibility and the accountability for their part in this, because all a recruiter is doing is presenting a person to a person who's going to manage them one day. It's really not much more complicated than that. But if your managers are not prioritizing it, they're not aligned to the job description, they're not aligned to the actual candidate experience, they don't care once they're hired, whatever the case may be, all of this is for naught. And that's part of the process. That's not just that's not just kind of the touchy-feely side. Like, your hiring manager has to be embedded in your process all the way through, from the time that the rec is posted to the first 90 days of the hire, because they are the person where the candidate is also ultimately going to end up. So making sure that those handoffs are clean, making sure that, you're tracking the timelines of responsiveness, making sure that you're tracking the quality of experience, the quality of hire by hiring managers, to get them embedded into the system. Because who is this for? It's for them. They have to hire that person. They have to onboard that person. They have to manage that person. So that's the second thing. And then the third is just data. I sometimes kind of go over the top, or have gone over the top with data, but without it, how do you know? At the end of the day, this is a supply chain, right? You have to know where each piece in your supply chain works. You have to be able to look at your data to truly be able to drive decisions, like, in a way that is meaningful to the business. So like I said, maybe we have a drag in our submission process, in our submission segment. Well, why are submittals down a day and a half, right? Well, this hiring manager has gone AWOL on me and now I can't get, well, we don't know that. We don't know that. And we can't go to the business to diagnose a problem if we're not tracking it. And you track it in your process, in your system from the beginning, so that you don't have to go in and try to insert it when it gets a lot harder. And that is something that I think we've tried to do at both stops. And something that I think came with me from the larger organizations, that I worked in, because at the end of the day, like, we're not trying to set ourselves up. We're always thinking about future us. It's easy now. It's easy today to go manually Excel line by Excel line for 88 lines. Can we do it for 8,800 lines? Can you do it for 88,000 lines? And that, I think, is the thinking where it kind of diverges a little bit. And you're like, hey, we need this here and now. But future us, we're not going to be able to keep this up. So what is this going to look like? That can work in your reporting. That can work in your candidate experience, your workflow setup, your funnel. There's not a place in your process, or within your talent acquisition function, where that's not on my mind, at least as we're trying to build and scale.
Yeah. The data piece is probably the biggest thing that I see gaps in organizations and in leaders. I originally started recruiting in a world where the numbers we hired were small, and you could manage everything through anecdote. I could recite everything that's going on everywhere. We were operating in, one market, really easy to understand. But when you're across multiple markets and entities, and anecdote's important to explain the data, but it can't stand on its own. Mostly, healthcare and these leaders are so operationally driven that they're used to, show it to me in the data and then explain it to me as to why the data is that way. So it is really different, than what you would normally see in a lot of other environments. There's so much that we could unpack in this entire data piece, and you talked about so many things. But if you said, here's 2 or 3 metrics that we really focus on as an organization, knowing there's a whole bunch of sub-cycle metrics underneath of that, what are the 2 or 3 metrics that you think truly are the ones that drive their differentiators? Because also often people just time to fill.
I don't know. I'm not going to give my age, but I've only done healthcare, so I'm not going to speak to there's not a lot of one recs in my world, right? We have a lot of recs that have multiple openings evergreen. So time to fill is relative. I mean, time to fill what? The entire batch of recs, one rec, time to fill is I think that must have been like an NBA word of the day in the 90s or something, because it doesn't really necessarily tell the story. For me, I have 2 key metrics, okay? Well, it's really 3, but, if we want to do 2. The first one is time to contact. Getting in front of the candidates immediately with a human, right? This is going to be critical, because everyone's going to be like, well, my AI bot talked to them. Well, their AI bot probably talked to your AI bot at some point in this world. So how quickly can we get a human in front of those candidates? And I can tell you, for us, that's already a differentiator, because we talk to candidates in person over the phone all the time. And we always get the feedback of, I'm so glad I'm talking to a person. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if this is just if this is AI or what have you. So that's the first thing. we have a 48-hour maximum. My recruiters are typically getting in front of their target candidates with under 24 hours, because you have to differentiate yourself by contact. The second thing, for us is the interview to offer standpoint. From the time that they schedule with a hiring manager on site, because it's so important for us to have candidates go and visit the facility just because of the nature of what we do.
Absolutely.
We can't skip that part. And I know that's not really in vogue necessarily anymore with the advent of, virtual interviews. It's a non-starter for us if they won't visit the hospital, because you have to see it and you have to feel it and you have to look around and be like, I can picture myself working in this environment. So that time that interview to offer standpoint, we have it set internally. It's 5 days or less. If we can get the candidate to interview and get an offer, that from that initial interview to an offer in 5 days, we have a really good shot at converting them. It gets into the upper 80s, right? Like it's a really good shot. And that's a differentiator to us because they're also probably interviewing in other areas. But mostly what it does, Jason, it shows respect to their time. Most of these candidates
Absolutely.
are coming off of shift, or they have to do something special to care for their kids, or, they're making concessions to you. So the best thing you can do is reward them with time. If you can show them early that their time matters, you are going to put yourself in a good place as an employer. The other one for me is just because we're so orientation driven and everything is structured in orientation, it's time to clear, right? How quickly we can get someone through the background and drug screen pipeline, because we have to be able to deliver. I kind of mentioned it as like, supply chain. We have to be able to deliver them on time for orientation at the next possible orientation. So those metrics for me are crucial. It's going to be time to contact, the interview to offer stage, and then basically the offer to start time frame.
Yeah, that's so familiar, and probably one of the biggest things that I focused on in my career was those, in my last stint at HCA was exactly that. How quickly can we get to talk to a person? This whole, some people are going, we give them an offer, within minutes of their application to kind of bypass all that. As I say, you don't have to outswim all the swimmers in the ocean. You have to, or outswim the sharks. You just have to be able to outswim the other swimmers. If you're doing 5 days, that's pretty fast. I mean, that's going to be very, very competitive in that space. One of the great things that you talked about, and I have to believe that this has to ring really well with your private equity owners, is talking about building for scale before you're big. And that's probably, I think, one of the biggest unique things of coming from where you've come from is you've seen the difficulty of building that operational discipline once you're big. Tell me how you're bringing in things that normally you'd only see in large scale employers now, to make that scaling easier.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is in the, like I said, in the front end processes of like thinking about things from just the standpoint of, 5 versus 50. The concept of future us is really important. So, things like candidate review is a really big thing, because when you have 8 hospitals and you have the candidate flow of 8 hospitals, well, reviewing people in that environment certainly is different than reviewing for 35 hospitals or what have you. So, making sure we have our knockout questions set up, making sure that we have our stack ranks set up correctly, all things that, we did at HCA, and that's scalability, right? Because you can't ask a recruiter to go through person by person by person by person, especially in the day and age of like kind of the AI applications, and applications the way that they are today. That's an impossible task, and it's not productive, right? I think one of the things that we try to focus on is like, your calendar being full doesn't make you productive. It doesn't make you effective, right? Like you have to be able to use your time on things that are going to move the business forward and ultimately get people in front of patients. So I think that's a really big thing, is the selection process. The other things that I would have rec set up, super important, because you're filling so many recs. and recs come and go, especially in our environment. Like I said, we're not like a tech company where we hire like 7 people in a month. We're hiring 90 people in a month, right? And so those positions are coming up and they're recycling through, and they're coming up and they're recycling through. Sometimes it's due to turnover. Sometimes it's due to growth, right? We have a new hospital that's coming up. Well, we have to have that process all set up so that when we do hire that team, they can go in and start creating recs. Well, how do we do that? Well, we pre-create our templates so they can just go in and request them as soon as possible, right? We make sure that everything is aligned for the flow through to the HRIS. We make sure that there's nothing in there that, even as simple as like job ads, right? Job ads are not job descriptions. So you're not just copy and pasting your job description into your job ad. At least a good recruiting team is not doing that. If you are doing that, you probably need to take a different look at that, because that's not what works in the search engines. But when you do that at scale, how do you do that for 25 hospitals? So you've got to make sure that you set up that piece so that you're not having to recreate the wheel every time you go and recruit, but you're also not leaving behind signs that, hey, this is more templatized, right? So there's a balance there. That's been something that's been very helpful for us, though, is because we've been able to take our time and build it up so that now we have a good system for rec creation and making sure that our recs are appropriately requested, posted, and kind of put through. Same thing with offers. And the offer request, I think, was one of the things that when I first got here was definitely a place that needed like modernization, but also just needed a little bit more, how do I say, like agility, and making sure that you have an agile offer process, because nothing sucks more than spending a bunch of time and money recruiting a nurse or a therapist or a CEO and then having it stall out an offer because your offer process is all messed up. So those things, when you're making a ton of offers, when you're looking at a ton of candidates and you're posting a ton of jobs, even in current state, thinking about what it looks like in future state, I think those are 3 areas that have been really critical for us. And that's just about leveraging our current ATS. We didn't need anything special for that. You just have to be able to go into your ATS, know what it can do, know what it can't do, and then build it appropriately.
It's interesting you say that, because the first recruiting conference that I went to, which is almost 20 years ago, they said the number one metric everybody should have is measurement of your current utilization of your current tools. And everybody's looking to buy some new magic tool to solve all their problems, and they haven't used the tools that they have at hand. And we're going to jump to this because it plays right into that. Now everybody's talking about AI and all this new technology, and we're going to buy AI and tools that can increase output. But what happens if an organization adds automation on top of a weak process, or is adding automation on top of a system that had automation that they didn't use?
Well, it's wasted. First of all, the first question I'm asking is, do your people know how to use it? Is it agentic? Is it just a tool that you're going to give yourself to make yourself more productive? Is it truly, is it language based? I mean, there are so many questions with that. Do your people really understand it? Or we try to avoid what's called the just do something file. And I think AI can be in that. I think AI is super helpful, and I use AI. I know, you probably use AI. A lot of people are going to use AI, but if you stick AI onto terrible data, well, AI is reading data. That's all it's doing. So if you don't have the infrastructure in place and you put a super robot on top of it, it's just going to take all your trash and spin it up for you. That goes back to kind of how you set up your system and how you set up your data, because it's reading those data points. That's what AI is doing, right? If you don't have a great candidate experience, it's going to amplify that. If you don't have great pass-through experience from one step to the next, it's going to amplify that for you. And definitely, like I said, in the data analytics side, all it's, garbage in, garbage out, but now massively at scale. It's just gonna set you up for failure. I think people are looking for, like you said, the magic bullet, and recruiting is a little more complex than it's giving credit for. So let's just put a program like a agentic or a couple agents in there and see what it can do. Especially in my world, where every state and every hospital is different and every position is different. A therapist in Ohio is not the same as a therapist in Indiana. That's not always something that's going to help me.
Well, and I think probably one of the biggest things I talk about, there's a difference between what I call artificial intelligence and aided intelligence, right? Or assistive intelligence. And so there's a lot of places, in the candidate engagement that you can use it, interview scheduling, candidate rediscovery, job matching, all of those kinds of things, optimizing campaigns. Those things are relatively easy to put in AI. It doesn't necessarily take away what you said, get him on the phone with a human. A human really needs to talk to these people and do these things, but it takes away a whole lot of work that recruiters often can't get to. You can't go do rediscovery in your entire database as a recruiter. You just don't have time. So there are some fantastic use cases to put AI in place that don't directly, push the recruiter away from the candidate.
Yeah, I don't want to make it seem like AI is not going to help. It is super helpful. And I use, like I said, I use it all the time to reduce my admin work. Definitely within the engagement, the interview scheduling. I think that they're making gains, but it's not perfect yet. And like candidate matching or kind of bubbling up old candidates. Like I think there can be some opportunity there. In healthcare specifically for us, I can see AI being a huge, huge player in scheduling utilization, right? And how much of your staffing issues are really just you have a poor schedule. That's a big thing, right? When you're thinking about the future of workforce and how, scheduling has really come to matter to candidates and it has really come to be kind of a make or break thing. So I can see it being very, like, genuinely a big piece to that, right? Is how can it go and recognize shift patterns? How can it recognize coverage issues? And how can it help to kind of fill in the gaps there? That may not be a direct recruiting tool, but we know like the best search is the one you don't have to run. And if I actually have people that are available that we're not seeing, or maybe my scheduler has missed or whatever, well, that's headcount that I don't have to fill, which is less time I have to go into the market, which means that we can focus on actually mission critical positions. So there's a lot to like there. And there are things I think that there's advancements there. I mean, obviously language model reporting is super cool if you're not a reporting guru because you just tell it what you want. So there are things there. I just think that, again, if your system, it just depends on how your system's set up. If your system is not set up for successful, augmentation with an AI, then it's just going to be a really expensive, like, this doesn't work moment. And if it is set up correctly, it will help you tremendously.
So I got one final question. If you had to leave the healthcare recruiting leaders with one piece of advice about scaling responsibly, what would it be?
Oh man. Have your process set up for future you early. Don't build a process that only solves today's problems, because once those legacy processes are in place, people are reluctant to give them up, and it's harder to kind of come back and build them back better. It's always easier to do it right the first time. So, first, understand what recruiting is and what it isn't. Have a good understanding of modern recruiting. And when you're talking to your recruiting leaders, make sure they do as well. Understand that activity is not productive. Like you're not, just because you're posting a bunch on LinkedIn or, you've got a ton of people, you've got a ton of applications. That doesn't mean that you have a healthy recruiting environment. So understand that. And then I think just making sure that you and your leaders have a good understanding of what KPIs actually drive the business. Because like we talked about, we joked about the time to fill. Well, time to fill may be important in some positions, in some companies, but if it's not truly important in your company, and it's maybe quality of hire, or maybe it's just, kind of what we focus on is the speed of which we operate at scale. You need to know that as an operator. You need to know that as a talent leader, and what KPI actually drives your business forward, and not just looks good on a talent acquisition deck, right? What is actually business significant?
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. The psychiatric healthcare world is one of the clearest examples of why recruiting can't operate in isolation with, high demand, the constrained supplies, and really getting integrated into your operation. I love the fact that you report directly to the CEO. I'm sure that's not always a good thing every day. But we talked a little bit about that, probably never got to meet the CEO at HCA, and now the CEO has your cell phone number number and probably uses it quite often. But a little note for our sponsor, Joveo. Thank you for having us here today. Joveo helps organizations bring the best talent to bear for the roles that you need to fill in your organization and engage them in a positive way to create efficient and effective hiring processes for organizations. And Justin, thank you so much for joining us. And it's so great to see where your career has gone over the last 10 years or so that we've known one another. You've done magnificent things, and you have a lot more ahead of you. So thank you so much.
Jason, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all your wisdom and setting me up on this journey. So I appreciate you and appreciate the time today.